Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today I am uploading two videos. The first one, this one, is how I sewed up this little number, and the second is how I patterned the collar. Just the collar, not the blouse itself. I've showed that in previous videos, but I shall link that one below. If you're interested in seeing how I sewed it up though, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric. This is a 100% viscose, super lightweight, super drapey, good for a little top like this. And this is my back. I have two layers of that fabric underneath my pattern piece, and I'm just snipping notches at the top and bottom of my placket. So that's that done. And onto the front. I have one layer of fabric underneath my pattern piece on the fold, a notch at the bottom of each of my dart legs and a notch at the centre front neck. And now to mark those darts. So I'm just popping a dot where that pin you see me place pierces the fabric. And then from that dot I'm just going to draw a line to the notch you see me snip. So that's one dart leg and the second marked. And of course I've done the same on the other side. And now to pin my darts. Popping a pin on the horizontal at the point of the dart, making sure my dart legs match top and bottom. And popping my pin directly through the top pen mark, out through the bottom pen mark and back up through again. Ready to stitch. Backstitching at the bottom of the dart legs and making sure my stitches run right through my pen marks. Pulling my threads at the end, I'll tie those off. And here I've just given my darts a little bit of a press, so I'm setting the front to the side for a second to work on my necktie. So I've just cut myself a strip of fabric which is about 2 inches wide, folded it in half along its length, give myself a little point at one end, and now stitching, back stitching at the start, sewing that little angle at the bottom, pivoting, and then the whole way down the length of the necktie at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, and back stitching at the end. So now I just need to trim down that seam allowance and turn the whole thing right side out. So I'm using my pinking shears just to reduce that bulk. And that's that trim the whole way along. And I'm using just a little wooden skewer I had in my kitchen drawer to turn my necktie right side out. So just pushing all of that fabric over the top of the skewer, pulling the fabric through and then removing the skewer. And then I'll give my tie a little bit of a press and I'm ready to attach it now to my front. So that's both of my ties done, and I'm just positioning them 1 centimetre in from my neckline. That will ensure that whenever I sew my shoulder seams together and I finish my neck, that I don't sew over the top of my ties. So at the machine now, just tacking those ties in place within my seam allowance. So I've just trimmed the edges of the ties and now I'm ready to sew up my shoulder seams. So I'm just laying my back on top of my front, wrong sides together first of all, and pinning. And to the machine. And stitching at about half of my seam allowance. Back stitching at the start and the end. And now I'm French seaming here, so I just want to trim off about 2/3 or so of that seam allowance. So that's how that looks. And now pressing my seam nice and flat. Then turning my fabric right sides together this time. Pressing again and pinning. And now stitching again at about half of my seam allowance. Back stitching at the start and the end. And that's my shoulder seams done. So I've given them a little bit of a press, so they're all nice and neat and tidy. So now I'm going to work on the collar. So I've cut out one piece of my collar here because I want to match that little flamingo. I want it to sit right on the front. So I'm just laying that cut collar piece over the top of some fresh fabric and lining up with that flamingo, pinning the whole way round and cutting out. And I've just repeated that process again to get my 4 collar pieces. So now I want to add some piping along the edge of the collar. So to help me out with this and try to be as accurate as I can, I'm giving myself a little guideline. So I've just taken one side of my collar and I'm running a stitch line right along the edge where I'll place the piping at a couple of millimeters inside my seam allowance. So that's my guideline all done, and now I'm going to line up my piping with that guideline and pin the whole way around. Of course I do the same on the other side, and now stitching. And I'm stitching right over the top of that first guideline, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's my piping tacked in place, and I've just trimmed the edge of the piping down, and now placing my second collar piece over the top of the first and pinning along the outer edge. Ready to stitch, and this time I'm stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. That will hide the stitch lines you've just seen me sew. Back stitching at the start and the end. And I'm going relatively slowly here. I'm trying to stick to that 1 centimeter seam allowance and be as accurate as I possibly can be. Pivoting around that lovely curve and back stitching at the end. So that's my 2 collar pieces joined together with the piping sandwiched in between. So now I need to turn my collar right side out, and to make sure everything lies nice and flat, I'm going to trim down that seam edge. And once trimmed, that's how it looks. So I've turned everything right side out and given it a nice press, and this is how my collar's turned out. So I'm super pleased with this, nice and neat. So I'm just lining up the edge of my collar at the back with the innermost notch you see me snip earlier on my placket. Pinning the whole way around, doing the same on the other side, and now stitching. And I'm stitching here at a millimeter or 2 inside my seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's how that looks. And this stitch line is going to double up as a guideline for my bias finish. So I'm going to do exactly the same here as I did on the piping. I'm going to line up that bias with that guideline or the stitch line you just seen me sew and pin in place. I'm leaving myself a little tail at each end. I'll tuck that into my placket later. It'll just make the neckline nice and neat. But stitching now at my 1 centimeter seam allowance this time. Back stitching at the start, taking it nice and gently around that curve and back stitching at the end. So that's my bias attached. So now I need to trim that whole seam allowance down, including the bias, which I've went ahead and done here off camera and used my pinking shears to do that. And now I'm just pressing the bias away from the bodice, but I'm making sure that the seam allowance underneath that I've just trimmed is butted up against the bias. And now I'm understitching directly through that bias, through the seam allowance underneath, and I'm about 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters away from my bodice. So this is just going to help everything lie nice and flat around the collar. Back stitching at the end. So that's how that looks. And now I need to turn that bias in underneath and press. Ready for my second line of stitching, which will close the whole neckline up. So I've pulled my collar out to one side, I have my bias towards the bodice, and I'm stitching right along the edge of that bias. I'm using a little bit of a longer stitch length, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's my neckline all nice and neat and clean on the inside. So I love how this looks. So I have my ties all in place, my shoulder seams nicely French seamed, my collar all attached, and my neckline nicely bias finished. So now for the side seams. So I'm going to sew the side seams in exactly the same way as I did the shoulder seams. So I'm sewing my first line of stitching here at about half of my seam allowance. My fabric here is wrong sides together, and I've went ahead off camera and turned my fabric right sides together this time and stitching my second line at about half of my seam allowance again. So that's my side seams, nicely pressed and French seamed. And now I'm ready to finish my armholes. So I'm going to do a bias finish here as well. So in preparation for that, I've just folded one end of the bias in underneath and given it a press. And now just pinning that one end to the underarm seam. And stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. Back stitching at the start. Trying to stick to that seam allowance the whole way around. And when I get to my starting position, I'm just going to trim off the excess bias and tuck that cut edge in underneath the folded edge you've seen from earlier and sew over the top. Back stitch at the end. So that's my first line of stitching for my bias done. And off camera, I've just trimmed back that seam allowance in the same way as I did for the collar. And here I'm understitching about 1 millimeter or 2 away from my bodice, using that little bit of a longer stitch length again, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's my bias understitched. And again, off camera, I've just pressed the bias towards the inside. And now I'm going to stitch right along the edge the whole way around. Taking it nice and gently, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's how that looks. Super neat and tidy. I love this finish. So I've just given it a nice press, and now I'm ready to tackle my hem. So I'm doing a double folded hem here. So I've just folded the edge of my hem and pressed up about half of my seam allowance, folded again and pressed, pinned my hem in place, and now stitching right along that folded edge, using a little bit of a longer stitch length again, back stitching at the start and the end, and that's my hem all nice and neat and tidy. And again, I've just given it a bit of a press, and now I'm ready for the last thing I have to do, which is to sew up the placket. So in preparation for that, I'm just pressing my seam allowance towards the inside. I'm using those notches you seen me snip earlier as a guide for pressing, and then I've just pinned the edge of my fabric to my sleeve roll. That's just going to help to stabilize the fabric while I press in my interfacing. So this is just a really lightweight interfacing. It's just shy of 1 centimeter wide, and I've just placed it right on the inside of the seam allowance. And now in order to close up the placket at the top and the bottom, I'm folding it in underneath, leaving my seam allowance on top and pinning, and then to the machine to run a few stitches over the top. So this is the top of my placket, and I'm making sure that my stitch line lines up directly with the stitch line from the collar. So that's how that looks. And now just to turn those ends right side out. Give them a little bit of a press. And that is all of the preparations for my placket done. I just now need to sew the placket down the centre back. So I've just pinned my placket in place and I'm stitching right along the edge on the inside with a little bit of a longer stitch length, back stitching at the start and the end. And that's how that looks, nice and neat. And after a little bit of a press, so I've got my hem nicely tucked into the placket at the bottom, and at the top I've got that bias finish nicely tucked into the placket as well. So I just have a couple of last things to do. One is to sew on my buttons and the other is to sew my buttonholes. So for the buttonholes, I've just laid my first button about ½ an inch or so away from the collar at the top, and then I'm measuring from there at 3-inch intervals down the centre back, popping in a pin at each of those intervals, and then I'm going to use those pins as my starting point to sew my buttonholes. So sewing the buttonholes here in the usual way. So that's how my first one looks. So off camera I'll sew the rest of those, and this is how it looks. And now just to open the buttons, so I'm just popping a pin in at the edge of the button at the top, and I'm using my seam ripper here to cut through the very centre of the button. So the pin at the top will stop the seam ripper going right through my fabric beyond the buttonhole. And now just to add a little bit of fray check here, that will just stop the inside of the buttonhole fraying too much. And then for my buttons, so I've just pinned my top and bottom placket together, and now I'm just marking directly through the centre of the buttonhole through to the underneath placket to give me a little dot, which will be the position I need to sew my buttons on. And I've sewed my buttons on here off camera, and that is this little top complete. So on the back I've got that gorgeous placket the whole way up the centre back. I've got my armholes all nicely bias finished, my neckline, the collar in place, all bias finished, and my necktie. Got my hem all nicely tucked in underneath, and this is how it looks on. This is super comfortable. This fabric is so lightweight and flowy, really nice against the skin. I love the piping around the collar on this and the necktie. I like that it's black, it means that I can wear black shoes. I like the placket the whole way down the centre back. So this is just a really lovely, smart casual top that is perfect for me for summer.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you in my next one. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye folks!